Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hello, Annie Hastwell here with you for a special mini episode of Sundaku. We've talked to so many interesting authors on this podcast over the past few months that we plan to up the pace and regularly bring you single interviews in special extra episodes like this one. The book we're about to hear about is a mix that would appeal to most lovers of a good read. It's set in the Scottish Highlands. It has all the elements of a thriller. It's got mystery, death, romance, small-town politics and violence. But most alluring of all, it's got that sinister staple of dark fairy stories, the wolf, or actually lots of them. Once There Were Wolves is the second adult novel from Australian writer Charlotte McConaghy. It's been described as a thriller, but there's nothing formulaic about it. The writing I found quite poetic. The plot twists and turns and plays with reality. And Charlotte has a real story to tell about the planet, about the concept of rewilding, putting scary creatures like wolves back in the mix, and about what primal fears and instincts that arouses in humans.
My name's Charlotte McConaghy and I'm the author of Once There Were Wolves. It's the story of Inti Flynn, who is a biologist who's been tasked with the almost impossible project of reintroducing 14 grey wolves into the Scottish Highlands. And she's doing this on a rewilding mission to bring the kind of troubled, struggling landscape back to life. But of course, she has a lot of pushback from the locals because they're a densely packed farming population and they're fearful of this predator being introduced, and to potentially eat their livestock or endanger their lives. And Inti's kind of struggling with this pushback, and then she stumbles across the body of a mauled farmer, and she knows that her wolves are going to be blamed for this kill, and so she does a very reckless thing in order to protect her wolves and decides to set out and discover who's actually done the killing. It's a bit of a murder mystery. It's a love story. It's a story about sisters, nature. And I think ultimately it's the story of rewilding not just landscapes but hearts too.
I began this book expecting a poetic book about wildness and rewilding, and I really didn't see the first plot twist coming. When it did, I really sat up and paid attention. And it seems to me that your strength is keeping that strong sense of place and nature, but giving us a really strong, complex whodunit. It almost reminded me of a Nordic noir, actually, where we don't know what to expect next and who to suspect. So is that your background in screenwriting that gives you the ability to write so tightly and excitingly?
Well, thank you, firstly. Possibly, yeah, that might be what it is. Before I did my screenwriting degrees, I used to write big, sprawling fantasy epics for kids. So the writing was quite different, but it was always sort of quite focused on, well, I guess character-driven plot. So I suppose I brought that with me when I started to learn how to do, the craft of storytelling. With screenwriting, you learn about brevity, you learn about having a very active protagonist to lead you through your story, which is something that I think a lot of novels could use more of. So I always try to sort of bring that in and use that active protagonist to sort of, I guess, move more tightly through the storyline while allowing, I suppose, the language to draw us more into the setting and the emotional complexity.
It's interesting that you say a lot of novels don't do that. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think the novel is beautiful because it allows you into the inner workings of a character's mind, and you can kind of sink down into that, and therefore you're not compelled in the same way as in a screenplay to make your character as active as as they need to be in a film. And I think that sometimes that really works for a novel. Like, it's nice to just sort of sit within them, but but I actually like stories better when you've got a protagonist who is actively making choices that generate story, which is something that you have to have in a screenplay. And I think I took that learning and tried to apply it to novels. And that's one thing that you get particularly in genre. So the crime genre, you've always got very active protagonists because they're actively trying to solve a crime, whereas in literary fiction they sort of tend not to have to be quite as active.
This story is very much not a story about good wild wolves and bad humans destroying the environment. And the main character, Inti Flynn, is a prickly, damaged kind of person who takes no prisoners. And she's sometimes a bit of an anti-heroine almost. Can you talk a little bit about the social milieu that she comes into in Scotland on her rewilding project and how she and the wolves upset the local Scottish farmers?
Inti kind of arrives with a bit of a chip on her shoulder. She's got a lot of baggage. She's brought a lot of rage with her about something that's happened in her past. It's an attack on her and her sister. We don't know until further along in the book what's actually happened, but we get a sense that she's haunted and simmering with fury. And so I suppose arriving in this hostile environment, carrying that with her is not going to reap very good cooperation in a difficult sort of situation. She's brought these wolves here on a very progressive rewilding mission into a community that has for a long time relied almost solely on their farming. So these people see farming as the way of the Highlands, their means of survival. Their forefathers have done it. They think of their ancestors as having rid the country of vermin, as in the wolves. And so they feel quite betrayed at the thought of their government allowing these creatures to be brought back, a predator that might, inflict further damage on their already kind of very highly pressurized lifestyle. So she's kind of entering that difficult space, and she's not in the mood to appease anyone. She's done with people, and if they sort of aren't going to get on board, she's not going to waste time trying to convince anyone of anything. So that's something that she will obviously come to realize that's not the best way to approach something like this. It needs togetherness, and it needs cooperation. It needs communication and understanding from both parties. You kind of can't go at it as though it's a fight, and this is what both sides of this do.
It's interesting watching her fall in love because it's pretty hard for her to do that given her personality that you've just described.
Yeah, she's pretty damaged and she's very untrusting. So Duncan, her love interest, who's also the local police chief, is kind of, I don't want to give anything away because he also becomes sort of her main suspect in terms of who might have done the murder. But he presents to her this sort of, I suppose it's a highly vulnerable way of life, that idea of opening yourself up to connection and empathy and love when that has been sort of a brutal pain in the past. So her mistrust of him is very much coming out of that wound, and she's really going to have to work to sort of either trust him again or figure out if he's a danger.
And then there's also the intriguing presence of her twin sister, who always remains a mystery, and we're not going to let you give anything away here, obviously. But there were times when I wasn't even sure she really existed.
Yeah.
Did you deliberately write it like that?
Yeah, I wanted that feeling of Aggie's almost a ghost. And I think there's a point where Inti isn't sure if she's a ghost and Aggie's not sure if she's a ghost. And I think that's the sort of effect of the trauma that they've been through. She's very changed as a person. I think it's easy to sort of tell the narrative of the trauma survivor who becomes tough and strong and unbreakable from that point. But there's also a narrative that's important that is of the trauma survivor who becomes more fragile and more vulnerable. And just really struggles through life because, that's something that does happen to some people. And that's Aggie. She's sort of gone from this fiery, strong, protective presence in Inti's life to a very different sort of ghostly figure who's smaller, frightened. She's silent. She's being quieted by this trauma. That's really difficult for Inti, and it's sort of, I think there's a thread throughout. She loves this sister desperately, sort of more than she loves herself, but is she going to need to disconnect from her at some point for survival?
You've got this tough character, Inti, but she's also got this thing called synesthesia, which is like an incredible empathy. It's a very strange condition to give someone like her, I thought.
Yeah, she has mirror touch synesthesia, which is a real and very rare condition. The sensations that she sees, her brain tricks her into thinking that she's felt them. So, for example, if I saw you get a punch to the face, I would feel it in my face, or a tender touch, I would feel that too. So, as you say, it's a really extreme, radical form of empathy, and it's something that she's grown up thinking of as a gift. But then, of course, the sort of hardships of life and the cruelty that she witnesses in people, I guess, shifts her, the way she views this condition, and she starts to see it as a burden, a curse that she needs to sort of protect herself from. And I liked the idea that, she could be this sort of highly empathetic person, but battling that, seeing that as a vulnerability, as something that makes her fragile, and then, of course, over the course of the novel, she'll need to sort of open herself back up to that empathy.
Fascinating human characters. And then we have the wolves. Some reviewers have seen the wolves as being a metaphor, which I don't know. Do you think they are? Are wolves themselves a metaphor for something that humans need to think about?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't want to reduce them to a metaphor for humanity. I think they're precious and strange and wild and beautiful in their own right. And they have these sort of really extraordinary, complex individual personalities. I based them, a lot of them on, well, sort of roughly based them on a lot of the wolves from Yellowstone. And they do have these incredible stories of courage and adventure and sacrifice and love. They're sort of just amazing stories in their own rights, amazing characters in their own rights. But I suppose if, we're looking at everything in the novel as a bit of a symbol or a metaphor, then certainly they have to be a metaphor for our own sense of wildness and that harmony. I think that for me, rewilding is about finding the harmony we used to have. Rewilding ourselves is about finding balance. Wolves are crucial to their environments because they allow for that balance that lets everything thrive. And so I think in that way, then they're not perhaps the metaphor we think of them as, aggression, dominance, violence, danger. In fact, it's the opposite, I think. I think they represent, well, in this novel and for me in real life, they represent loyalty, compassion, and that balance in wildness.
Is it also about letting wildness in, though? We're not seeing it as the big bad wolf, but more seeing it as another side of life that we should perhaps accept more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a kind of, I think it's a crucial part of us that we sort of forget, it's easy to forget about. And then we all have that feeling, I think, when we go out into nature and there's that sort of sense of rightness and quiet and peace, I think. And I would say that that's sort of that very ancient memory of how we used to be more connected.
And yet the thought of walking through a forest at night where there might be wolves is still absolutely terrifying.
True, but you know what? They're not actually, they're highly unlikely to attack you. They're much more likely to run the opposite direction.
Now, your last book, Migrations, and this one have an extremely strong sense of place and quite poetic descriptions of wildness. How do you research to get that kind of detail and authenticity? Because I'm imagining you holed up in the Scottish mountains writing this one.
I did go there for my research. I'd been there a few times before, and then I went back on a specific research trip. I didn't write it there, though. I think it's part of what I love about writing is just to kind of shut myself away and then disappear into another world, another place. You have to really try to imagine the detail of a place, and that's, that is research. You need to see a place. My phone is full of photos of like foliage, like tiny little flowers and leaves and bark and all that sort of thing, because I wanted to be able to remember it well enough to describe, the detail that can transport you. But there's also places in my books that I haven't been, and that's a different kind of research, it's a different kind of imagination. I hope it transports people regardless.
Both these books obviously make you think pretty seriously about climate change. So I guess behind the thrillingly good story that you tell, there's a real message that you would like to get across.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I guess if I can slow people down and just allow an avenue for them to connect emotionally with this issue, I think there's a lot of power in that. It's easy to become apathetic in the face of the enormity of this issue, and the barrage of news that we get, the bad news that seems never ending. But I think what fiction has the power to do is connect you with humans who might have a slightly different perspective to you, or see things from a different viewpoint, have a different lens over things. All that is so important to kind of triggering our own thought processes and allowing us to kind of really rigorously think about how we feel, what we think about these issues, what we want to do. Are we going to step up and help? We've got plenty of time left to sort of make a change, and I hope that these books galvanise people, energise people, give them enough hope, ready to sort of take up that fight.
Do you think it will sell well in Scotland, or have you got any idea whether it does?
I am hoping that it appeals there, that it does well, that it gives, provokes a bit of thought.
I'm sure it will get them talking.
Yeah, well, it is kind of a hot topic, I think, that a lot of people are discussing in Scotland at the moment, which was part of the reason I set it there.
Great book, Charlotte. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's lovely to chat.
Author Charlotte McConaghy talking about her book, Once There Were Wolves. And that's it for this Sundaku mini special extra. Watch out for episode 11 of Sundaku arriving next week, when amongst other things we'll talk about how Vikings, who didn't even have a written language, have had such an enormous influence on literature, both highbrow and lowbrow. And also, Kath Keneally will bring you an interview with Ellis Gunn about her chilling account of being stalked. It's called Rattled. I'm Annie Hastwell. This has been a Sundaku Minisode. We'll talk soon.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.